Cool. So today we'll be talking about the sea otters of Glacier Bay in Alaska. So a little bit of background on the species. The sea otter Anhydra lutris is a keystone species to the native environment. It's found up and down the Alaskan coast, as well as some parts of California and over into Asia. The interactions between the species and those around it can completely change the landscape of the aquatic home that they live in. And some important information before we begin our presentation today include a little bit about the historic decrease in the population. Fur trade was a huge issue for this species. It's also an important species to Indigenous people. It's also managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they're protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. This is relevant, again, to the Indigenous peoples because they've got a certain amount of takes for the species, but they do sustainably harvest it. In regards to the carrying capacity, it's unknown at the moment since this is a recovering stock, and management has been occurring since 1911, but it's still not up to par with where we think it needs to be. Stocks are stable, but they're still threatened and continue to be growing. I also want to mention that the sea otter is a keystone species in regards to sea urchins and orcas. They play a role in orca food chains, and we'll touch a little bit later on how they act in regards to urchins.
So in the late 1960s, there was a program involving the translocation of about 400 individual sea otters to the Glacier Bay region. This map here on the right shows colored regions representing the potential areas occupied by sea otters as of 2012, and the areas in dark gray are unoccupied. Each green circle on the map represents a historical site where the translocations occurred back in the 60s. So aerial survey data for this study was for Article 1 was collected in 4 regions of Glacier Bay area, and it's broken up into these subregions. There were a total of 47 repeated aerial surveys from 1995 to 2012 in the Glacier Bay region, as well as Yakutat and northern and southern Southeast Alaska. There was a plethora of process-oriented aerial surveying done in this time. However, the raw data did not account for sources of estimation error, over-dispersion of aerial count data, stochasticity, and other covariates that might have influenced current abundance and future population dynamic trends. This is important for management to incorporate and adapt to in order to best represent the sea otter populations in their management programs. And this relates to class because it applies to the process-oriented sampling methods we talked about, which would be aerial surveys in this case. It is a state-based Bayesian model, and it examines abundance in relation to processes that we spoke about in class, such as immigration and emigration, growth rate, and harvest mortality.
So the second article that we read and reviewed for our project talks about more of the modeling aspects. And there are a number of common issues associated with modeling spatiotemporal data that's important for estimating distribution and abundance, which is a key part of conserving and managing wildlife. So the objective of this paper was to describe an improved model framework that takes into these issues, and some of these issues include accounting for multiple levels of detection probabilities, combining multiple sources of data into a single modeling framework, and then just the computational limitations to modeling fine scale inferences. And this relates to our sea otters because the paper demonstrated this improved model framework using aerial survey data of sea otters in Glacier Bay. And there's a number of different ways that this article related to things that we've learned in class. Most notably was the author's use of Program R for their modeling, which really just goes to show how useful and ubiquitous Program R tends to be, especially in ecological fields. Within their modeling, they use matrix and vector algebra, habitat covariates, as well as parameterization to fit desired models.
So in this Article 1, which was titled Trends in Carrying Capacity of Sea Otters in Southeast Alaska by researchers Tinker et al., these field methods pertain to the process-oriented survey methods where data was obtained between 1995 and 2012. However, the study itself, the paper itself, was a meta-analysis of that previously collected data. So this study only used aerial survey data and not SCIF data. But historically, surveying was done by SCIF along transects on the coastline. And this was a problem because it neglected to account for sighting and availability bias. So in these aerial surveys, what they would do between 1999 and 2012 was take data along strip transects along the coast, as well as send out intensive search units or ISUs, which were flown at other times to account for sea otters that were not sighted during the survey times. And this helped them to calculate a correction factor for those not sighted that were not available during the survey. Data was analyzed in the actual study in a spatiotemporal modeling model, and this allowed them to estimate the sub-regional sea otter abundance over time measured in years. This is a density-dependent process-oriented model, which took into consideration dispersal, range expansion, harvest mortality, and environmental stochasticity.
Sorry about that. All right, so for our second article, it was a little less hands-on than the first one. It was the design and implementation of a modified Bayesian model to accommodate spatiotemporal changes in Glacier Bay in regards to the occupancy and abundance of sea otters. So they utilized data in this survey from 3 different surveys that were aerial surveys previously conducted by other studies. In the first survey, it was just a basic aerial survey using transect lines over a wide area. The second survey was connected to the first one, and they randomly selected subsets of that area and circled sites to obtain exact counts of sea otters. They spent a certain amount of time at the sites in order to get exact counts and account for any animals that may be underwater or animals hidden by another. For survey 3, it's kind of an overarching survey that included data from 1993 to 2012 that helped examine spatial distribution of the species. And the third survey kind of supplied information that filled in gaps from the first and second surveys. And it allowed for predictions to be calculated within the model. And the model here was a little bit too complex to put exactly underneath data analysis, but basically the researchers input the data they had collected from surveys 1, 2, and 3 and reworked it into the partial differential equation. And using those numbers, they averaged out lower, upper, and mean abundance values for each year from 1993 to 2010. And within that, they described each parameter and utilized this data, planned to utilize this data to predict growth in years to come for the species in order to better manage them.
All right, so I'll be talking about the results and discussion of the first article. So for their findings, they found that almost all otters were found in high-density areas, and the otters were also observed in primarily small groups or just singularly by themselves. And sub-regional growth rates start off high at the beginning of a colonization, and then as time goes on, the growth rates level off. So the population is experiencing growth from 400 translocated individuals in the late 60s. It has grown to, when the article was made, over 25,000 individual otters, and the authors expect that this population could triple in size in the future. So it suggests that they could reach a much, much larger population than they have now. And for relevance, so sea otters are predators of sea urchins, and when sea urchins are left unchecked, they create these things called urchin barrens, and they will overpopulate and decimate kelp forests, and they will leave a wasteland of urchin behind, as you can see in this picture right over there. So sea otters keep those urchins in check and help kelp forests stay flourishing, which promotes incredible biodiversity for fish and just keeps the ecosystem in check. So that's why sea otters are important to ecology.
So for the findings in Article 2, the authors found that with their improved model framework, that estimating occupancy and abundance together in a cohesive framework yielded a number of advantages, including improved computational performance, easier model interpretation, the ability to estimate additional latent parameters, and the ability to model elusive or difficult to estimate species. So this contributes to ecology because estimating distribution and abundance, especially of colonizing species, is critical for good management. And this type of model has a number of different potential applications, including the reintroduction of endangered species, like the sea otters in Glacier Bay, as well as invasive species management and characterizing wildlife or plant diseases, really in general, just any species or organism that is experiencing an expanding or contracting distribution.
All right, so that brings us to the end of our presentation today. If you're interested at all in learning more from either of these articles, there are links right here. But thank you for joining us and have a good rest of your day.